happens, I joined the Navy in World War II. I had just graduated high school, and I lived out in the country those days in Rhode Island. And it was hard times. We didn't have much money and so forth. So I decided, well, I better go get a job and earn some money. And I started working, and I was working at the Charleston Airport in Charleston, Rhode Island, and we were building an airport for the Navy in World War II. This was 1942, early part of 1942. And where I lived was kind of a Navy town, because the Navy was coming and going when the sailors were off on Liberty and so forth, and they would come to my town. And I was living 18 miles from New London, Connecticut, and that's where the naval station was. And we had a roller skating rink that was built, and it was for young guys, you know, 15, 16, 17, 18 years old, 19, whatever. And a young crowd would go roller skating there. That was one of the forms of entertainment, and we didn't have much at that time. And I would see a number of sailors in there, coming in there skating, roller skating, and they would be repeat sailors. They would come, so I got acquainted with them. I talked to them. They would tell me about the Navy and so forth. And the year was rolling along toward the end of the year there in 1942. And a lot of my buddies from high school were going in the military. Some of them were getting drafted. And I said to myself, I don't know, I better make up my mind, because I don't want to get drafted. I prefer the Navy, because I talked to all these Navy guys, and they were telling me how nice it was and this and that. So in December of 1942, I went into the recruiting station in Providence, Rhode Island. And it was a huge building there. The recruiting station had a huge brick building, and it comprised a block square. And when I got there, it was cold weather. And everybody had coats on and sweaters and all of that. And as I approached the building, the recruiting building, I noticed a long line of prospective enlistees wrapped around the entire building, the whole block. So it took me a while to find the end of the line. So I finally got in the line, and probably 2 or 3 hours later, I managed to get into the building. And I approached, when my turn came, I approached one of the recruiters, and he was a yeoman sitting at a typewriter. So I gave him all my information and everything else, and he signed me up and swore me in. I was officially in the Navy. The only thing he said to me just before I left, he said, we can't take you in the Navy right now. He says, we have too many. He said, we have no place to put these sailors. We're all filled up. He said, but we'll send you a letter. And it won't be too long. We'll send you a letter, and then it'll tell you where to report. I thought, well, hey, I get this letter, who knows? So I went back to work. And it wasn't too long, I got this letter in the mail, and it said, report to Sampson, New York, on such and such a day, to the boot training. I didn't know where Sampson, New York was. I found out later it was upstate New York, out in the country. And then I told my mother, I said, well, I got this letter. I said, I'm going to be leaving. So we made preparation to leave, and then the next day, another letter showed up in the mail. It said, cancel the first letter, report to Newport, Rhode Island, which was the state I was in. And I was living about 40 miles from Newport, Rhode Island. So, okay, that wasn't very far to go. I knew exactly where it was. So on that date, I showed up. And I served my boot training at Newport, Rhode Island for about 3 months. And we were given a 30-day leave. But they said, after your 30-day leave, you don't come back here. You're going to be in the U.S. Navy Armed Guard. I never heard of it. I thought, what's the Armed Guard, you know? And I talked to one fellow, a Navy fellow, and he says, oh, I know what the Armed Guard is. He says, they're gonna give us a rifle, and they're gonna send us to Washington, D.C., and we're gonna walk around the Pentagon with a rifle on our shoulder. I said, wait a minute. I said, you know, that's a big joke. Anyway, we reported to Brooklyn, New York, the Armed Guard Center, which was an armory. And you know how they build armories, with a big, huge arch building and all brick and everything. Well, they converted it to a naval station. And the main floor entry was the berthing quarters for about 1,000 sailors. You're going to be here for maybe a couple of weeks, and you'll be picking up a ship in Chester, Pennsylvania, but it's not quite ready. So in the meantime, we're going to let you go on liberty in New York City and so on and so forth. So a couple of weeks went by, and one morning at muster, they called out our names. They said, you, and you're going to Chester, Pennsylvania. And they gave us transportation. We went by train. And we got over to Chester, Pennsylvania. We found out, we went to the shipyard, we found out that ship wasn't quite ready. And they said, well, we're not quite ready yet. We can't let you board the ship. So they put us up in the YMCA for a couple of weeks. By that time, the ship was ready. They called us. They said, you can board the ship now. Okay, so we did. We got on the ship. I had never been aboard a ship before in my life. And they showed us our quarters. We were assigned a gunnery officer, Navy gunnery officer. He was an ensign. He was in charge. And he showed us around the ship, and then showed us our berthing quarters, assigned us to our berthing quarters, and so forth. And once we got settled in, we decided, well, let's go around the ship and look at the guns, because we're going to be gunners. And so we went around and looked at all the guns. But you know, I forgot something. I forgot to tell you that prior to going to that armory in Brooklyn, New York, we were sent to Little Creek, Virginia, to gunnery school for a couple of months to learn how to handle and maintain and fire the guns that were on merchant ships. All the merchant ships had the same guns, whether it was a tanker or whether it was a cargo ship. All the guns were the same. There was about a dozen guns of various types. So that's what we did. Then we went to the armory in Brooklyn, New York, and then Chester, Pennsylvania, to pick up the ship. So when we got on the ship and were secure in our quarters, we decided, well, let's go around and look at the guns. So we looked at all the guns and we located where the ammunition was and all that kind of routine. So then after a couple of days, we had to go through what they call the degaussing range for the ship. That's for the magnetism and all of that. So we sailed down to Chesapeake Bay for a couple of days, going back and forth, going through this degaussing range about three or four times, until they said, okay, your ship's okay. It won't get hit by a mine that might be floating out there, with the magnetism of the ship. So that was the deal, and then we finally set sail. The first trip was to New York. We went to New York and we got some orders to go sail down the east coast of United States. And at that time, the east coast was loaded with German submarines, and they were sinking the ships left and right. Every day they were going down. So by a quirk of fate, we made it all the way down the coast and around Florida into the Caribbean, and we went to Port Arthur, Texas. Had an oil refinery there, and we loaded up with fuel to run on. And then they loaded us up with a load of kerosene. They never tell you where you're going, because that's top secret. So we didn't know where we're going, where we're going to deliver this kerosene. It turned out we went back to New York with the kerosene, offloaded it in New York City. Those days they were using kerosene in homes to keep warm and so forth, had kerosene stoves. So then after that, we went back to Texas. And we took on some more fuel. And this time it was bunker fuel for ships to run on. We had about 100,000 barrels of black fuel. It looked like tar. Is that black? And there again, we didn't know where we were going. It's top secret. Nobody's telling you where we're going. They had posters the Navy had posters all around. And the poster said, loose lips sinks ships. So you had to keep your mouth shut. We finally set sail and we went to Aruba. And we picked up more fuel in the island of Aruba, which was owned by the Netherlands. The name of the ship was the SS Jalapa. It was a merchant ship, and the SS stands for steamship. A Navy ship has the letters USS, which stands for United States Ship, and then the name of the ship. So that's how you distinguish one ship from another. And we went to Aruba, we picked up some more fuel, and there was a Dutch island in the West Indies. We went to the town of Oranjestad. So then we set sail We're going to Australia. Sydney, Australia. And that was about 10,000 miles away. And we're sailing all by ourselves. We had no escorts, no ships going with us to protect us in case the enemy submarine showed up. There were no aircraft flying over us once in a while to keep track of us. Because we could do 16 knots. That's the reason we sailed by ourselves, because they said those days we could outrun a submarine at that speed. And we had to follow a zigzag course. Now, in following a zigzag course, the helmsman is given the course to follow by the officer of the deck, or the mate. And then there's a buzzer in the wheelhouse that goes off about every 3 minutes, maybe 5 minutes. And when the buzzer goes off, the helmsman changes course to another course. Then the buzzer goes off again in 3 to 5 minutes. The helmsman changes course again. He does that. Every helmsman that's on watch for 24 hours, it's a 4-hour watch, they continually follow that procedure. It took us 28 days to arrive in Sydney, Australia. We didn't see a ship en route. We didn't see a plane. We didn't see the enemy. We didn't encounter any enemy. We were fortunate. But we got there and we offloaded about a third of our fuel in Sydney. And then we gave us a few hours liberty. We went out and looked at the town. And then we got back on the ship and we went up to Brisbane, Australia, offloaded another third of our fuel. And then we finally went to Townsville, Australia. These towns are all on the east coast of Australia. And one is north of the other. Excuse me, Townsville was all the way north, the northern part of Australia. And it was the closest town to New Guinea. At that time, the invasion was going on in Lae, New Guinea. The Australians and the Americans were invading Lae, New Guinea when we were in Townsville. They had a hospital in Townsville. Townsville was a small town. It was like a country town out in one of the western states. That's what it reminded me of. And they had a hospital there. They also had U.S. Navy doctors and U.S. Navy nurses working in that hospital along with the Australians. And I saw with my own eyes ambulances showing up at the docks with the wounded from Lae, New Guinea, putting them in stretchers and taking them, wheeling them into the hospital. And I saw many doctors walking the streets. They were in uniform. They were officers and nurses. They were also a nurse is an officer in the military. So they were all there doing their job. And I kind of witnessed that firsthand. And I was kind of glad that I didn't have to take part in the Lae, New Guinea invasion. Now, since our tanks were empty, a rumor was going around the ship amongst the sailors that, well, I guess we're going to go back to the States now and go to a refinery somewhere and pick up some more fuel and so forth. Well, folks, that didn't happen. What happened was we went back to Brisbane for some further orders, and we had a little liberty, maybe 4 or 5 hours. And then we left there. Oh, I went to a barber shop to get a haircut. And just as a side thing, we had a couple of sailors on the ship that would cut our hair, but they were not professional barbers. It was my impression when I looked at the haircuts that they gave, it looked like they were sheep shearers to me, so I tried to avoid getting a haircut from them. And so anyway, I went to the barber shop in Brisbane. We sailed south and went around the southern coast of Australia to the Indian Ocean. When we got to the Indian Ocean, the captain announced that we were going to sail north to Baghdad. But we stopped at Iran at a refinery, and the name of the town was Abadan. And we picked up fuel there because they had a big, huge refinery. And we were on good, friendly terms with the Iranians those days. We also went to another town by the name of Karamshah. Had an army base there. That's why we went there. And we were short of toilet articles and things like that from the States. So our officer said, well, I'll see if I can commandeer a truck and all you fellows pile in his truck and we'll go to the army base, which he did. So we went there, we went in the exchange and bought our things and came outside. And I noticed there was some Russian officers standing outside in front of the post. So I started talking to them. I didn't even know if they could speak English. They could, and it turned out they were pilots, officer pilots, Russian. I said, you know, if you don't mind, may I ask, what are you doing here? Oh, this fellow said, you know those planes that your ships have been delivering here? He said, once they're offloaded and reassembled and ready to fly, he says, we Russian pilots fly those planes to the Russian border. I says, how far is that? That's 700 miles north of here, he says. I says, then what happens? He says, well, then the German pilots then the Russian pilots there take the planes and they fly them over Germany and bomb Germany. See? So that's what we were doing. We were bringing the planes so that the Russians could bomb Germany. And that's why they liked us, you know, because we were helping them and we were keeping the Germans away from Iran and all that. So we were on friendly terms. So we did that routine, and then we came back down and we stopped at, this time, Durban, South Africa, and delivered some more oil to them. But then this time, we were heading back to the States. And we left Durban, but we didn't realize it until we were on course for a couple of days. We were sailing east in the Indian Ocean, see? And we were going to pass southern Australia. So what happened was, we did that. We also pulled into Sydney. We made a stop at Sydney and gave them some oil that we had on the ship. And then from there, we sailed back to the States by way of the Panama Canal, the Caribbean, and all the way up the East Coast to Chester, Pennsylvania, where we got the ship. Then we got off. There was 26 sailors and myself, 25 and myself and the gunnery officer, all Navy. We were gunners. That's what we were put on that ship for, to be the gunners and to guard that ship in case of enemy attack. So happened in that entire trip where we traveled 75,000 nautical miles on that trip. We could have gone around the earth 3 times. And it took 10 months, that entire trip. We were away from the States 10 months. In the meantime, I made a rating aboard the ship. Not as a gunner, but as a coxswain or a boatswain, as they call it now. They changed the rating to third-class boatswain.
Hi, my name is Jesse Hiles. I'm currently serving as officer in the United States Coast Guard. I'm here today aboard the SS Lane Victory, just reminiscing about my days as a volunteer here back in high school. I started as a sophomore, and I worked with the armed guard crew, but I pretty much did anything around the ship that needed to be done. But it was one of the greatest opportunities of my life, getting to work with all the World War II veterans and hearing their stories and being a part of the living history that is the SS Lane Victory. I served for 2.5 years and got to do all kinds of stuff. We went on cruises to Catalina, the monthly cruises in the summer. I went down to San Diego twice on cruises and just got to serve with the great veterans and volunteers here, and is one of the best experiences of my life. Sure. Well, I was just a high school student, a kid really, so I got to do lots of the menial labor. I did lots of chipping paint, and then repainting, and then chipping more paint, and then repainting. I would clean the guns. I'd oil down all the guns once a week. Just did lots of cleaning. We'd hang Christmas lights up at Christmas, or pretty much anything they told me to do. We just kind of knocked it out as a team and had a great time, and learned a lot from the other volunteers. And yes, my adopted grandfather is Charlie Savona. He is the leader of the armed guard crew and has been the leader of the armed guard crew for over 20 years aboard ship. And he took me under his wing when I was a volunteer, and through just teaching me about the ship and my volunteer work, but he was more than that. He was a mentor, and all the guys were. They taught me so much about life and what was important. Probably one of the greatest takeaways from being here was just a respect for my elders, and really understanding the value of elderly people and the stories they had, and that you should really stop and listen to what they have to say, because they've experienced lots of life. So.
And my name is Maurice Henry Shanahan, and I came down here to volunteer when this ship came down from San Francisco, and my friend Bill McWade and myself, we've been on here ever since, until 11 years ago I moved to Palm Springs, California. So I just come down for a visit now and then. I was with the Air Force, and I hauled fuel, refueling aircraft, and then we hauled bombs and everything that had to be hauled off the docks, we hauled in there. And then when we first got there, the Japanese would come in at night and they'd bomb the B-29s, and finally they brought in night fighters, planes, and they would shoot them down. And I had a dengue fever, or dinghy fever they call it. A quite bad case of that. I finally got over it. And then they had an air raid one time when I was running for cover, and I fell over some coral rocks, and I hurt my knee pretty bad. And they sent me to Honolulu to a Triple General Hospital, and then they brought me back, and then Colonel told me, flight surgeon, he said, we're sending you back home because your knee's pretty well, we don't want to mess with it. So I was flown back to the States, and then I flew from Bristol to McKinney, Texas, a hospital, and was discharged from there. That was about it. Well, there was a lot of rust on this ship when they brought it down, and we spent a lot of time chipping the decks and everything that needed chipping and repainting it and all that. And it was interesting. And you know, I was in the Merchant Marine during the Korean War, and hauling bunker oil from Los Angeles to Portland, and the next trip would be Seattle and back forth. And then finally they took the ship, it was leaking oil one time all the way to Seattle, so when they took it in the dry dock, they strapped it, they paid us off, and gave us enough money to get home. And I went back to truck driving. So I've been 48 years in the Teamsters Union, driving trucks.
My name is McWade, William McWade. Everybody calls me Bill. And I was in the Navy, and my rank was sonar first class, sonar man first class. Sonar being hunting and killing in submarines. I served on a fleet tug, of all things. It was fast enough to run with the fleet, had a lot of armament. We had depth charges for submarines, so we could escort or anything. And when a ship got hit, we'd go out and get it. And we had a small crew of divers on board and a small crew of civilian firefighters, so we could patch the ship up during the battle and haul it out of there. So we served in about every island in that stepping stone of islands. The first one I was on, these were all first day affairs, was Kwajalein. And the idea was to capture these islands and build airfields and go across the Pacific. So we went Kwajalein, Enuitak, and a bunch of others I can't remember. And the bigger ones, Saipan, Tinian, Palau, Leyte, a million of them. So we saw a lot of action. A lot of kamikazes. I figured we had 140 kamikaze attacks. We didn't actually sail with the battleships and carriers because they ran at 30 knots. We couldn't go that fast. So we would meet them and fuel them or transfer men or whatever had to happen. And one time we got caught in the worst typhoon they ever had. It sank a whole bunch of Navy ships, killed 700 men. Terrible. I was riding my Harley Davidson one day and I saw these trucks go by and they were hauling something, so I decided to follow them and find out where they were going. And he came down here and I saw this old rust bucket, so I went aboard it. And here I are.
My name is Paul Chipinelli. I've been called Chips because of the fact if you wanted to get your clothes back from the laundry, you had to have your name on them. And Chipinelli was just too big, so they called me Chips. That's how I got that handle, and it stuck with me ever since. I was in the Navy. I served on a communication ship, the ex-President Jefferson. It was called the Henry T. Allen. And I served, which is a communications ship. And we served on the Battle of Leyte Gulf, which was the only one I was in. There was this time we were in some harbor, I don't know where, but every morning we would get up, me and 2 or 3 other guys. We would go up on top where the galley was. You got a cup of coffee, go up on the top, look at all the ships in the harbor. There was battleships and carriers and all that. So we used to do that every morning. So one morning, we got up, got our coffee, we went up on top. Everybody was gone. All the ships were gone. Well, then I said, well, who's protecting me? You know, all these. But anyway, about 4 days later, we heard about the invasion of Iwo Jima. So that's interesting. And my wife and I just moved to San Pedro because we hated the San Fernando Valley because of the heat. We took a little cruise in the harbor cruise. My wife says, hey, there's an old ship, this one here. Why don't you join them? And so I did, and I've been happy ever since. I love this old ship. Reminds me of the where I was, you know. And I'm happy here. Now, my job here on the ship, since I don't walk too well, I work on the gangway. I check people going in and going off the ship. Great ship, really. This ship was made in April of 1945. Of course, you know, the war was over in August. So this didn't see any enemy action because, you know, the war was lost anyway to those guys. But it did go to Korea. Do you know about the Korean incident on this ship? This ship at one time in the Korean War, the ship rescued 7,000 refugees from North Korea. Now, 7,000 on this ship is standing room only. And we're very proud of the fact the Korean people in this Southern California love this ship. They come here and have parties quite often because of the good deeds that we did in those days. And we're proud of that.
My name's Wendy Joseph. I'm a able seaman in the Merchant Marine. AB Unlimited, that means I can sail on any ship in any ocean. And unlimited actually means that there's an unlimited number of things I can screw up. My father, Sam Hackham, was part of the original bunch that got this ship, the Lane Victory, out of mothballs back in '89. He and his brother, my Uncle Solly. Dad was the radio operator, Solly was the chief engineer, and they joined together with a bunch of crazy old geezers who thought this pile of rust could be made operational again, and by God, they did it. I came aboard as a volunteer in '99. And shortly after that, I got my own Merchant Marine card. A Z card is what they used to call it because the numbers all started with a Z. They don't start with Z's anymore. Some guys still call them Z cards. And my father and uncle were both in World War II. So my dad was in World War II. He sailed in 1942 on the Murmansk Run, which was the deadliest stretch of water in World War II. At one point, the ship loss, we were losing 33 ships a month at that time. The Murmansk Run was the supply convoy to Stalin's Red Army. Now, without the stuff we brought them, hundreds of thousands of dollars of stuff, everything from food to socks to helmets to ammunition, everything an army needed to function. Without that, they would not have been able to hold their end up. The Eastern Front would have collapsed, Hitler would have won there and stood a good chance of winning on the Western Front. So yeah, we helped win the war. Now my dad was on the Murmansk Run in 1942. His diary of that time reads like notes from hell. Attack down, 24 hours. You've got 24 hours sunlight up north of the Arctic Circle in the summer. So they were getting attacked literally every 10 to 15 minutes. And he was looking at his diary a while later and said, I survived this. And at the time, all he could think of was, I wish they'd stop dropping those depth charges and let a guy get some sleep. It was just too noisy. Okay, but he survived that and helped win the war. He was also on one of the 5 ships that were sunk, torpedoed and sunk before Pearl Harbor. Hardly anybody knows about it, but the Germans did. The subs did torpedo and sink 5 merchant ships. His was sunk in October 19th, 1941. All hands were saved on that one. Thank God.
Hi, my name is Jerry Grew. I'm a member of the SS Victory Lane. My military background is 2 years in the Army. I went in 1967, got out in 1969. I was over in Korea. My MOS was a 94 B-20. My rank was an E5. I came out on an honorable discharge. I got involved with the SS Victory Lane in 2010 through my good neighbor Charlie Savonis, who is a Master's Chief's Boltzmann's mate, who's an ordinary animal, and he's the chief gunner of the gun department. My duties on the SS Victory Lane is the 5-inch gun, which is right behind me here. I do fire this at cruise time. Let me tell you a little bit about this gun. During wartime, this had a gun crew of 11 men that handled this. The main officer in charge stood right here. This to my right side is the elevation of the gun. To my left side is the swing of the gun. This gun has a recoil of 2 feet. It shoots a projectile powder keg like this. This is a dummy, but in wartime it would look like this. It would be a brass case and has 28 pounds of powder in it. The projectile, which is this right here, which it fired, weighs 55 pounds. This gun has a range of 10 miles. This gun is also protected with 2 50 Browning calibers, port and start, equal sides on the guns on each side. We have 4 20s on the starboard, 4 20s on the port. They have accurate range of within 3 miles. The Browning's the same way. Also on the stern of the ship, we have a 3-inch gun. It has a range of 7 miles and basically the same gun crew on it. This tell you a little bit about the SS Victory Lane. I'll tell you a little bit of her stats on her. She's 455 and 3 inches long. Her beam width is 61 feet. She has a speed of 16.3 knots. She's powered by 2 diesel engines in the engine room. She has 5 cargo holds. The ship was launched in 1945, and her biggest recognition that she's noted for was the evacuation of Busan of 7,000 Korean refugees. We are going to close out this part of it. We have a lot more to show you on the ship. The next thing we're going to show you is the Armed Guards logo. It's located right here. This is the Armed Guards logo during World War II. It's mounted on the magazine, which the shells came out through the bottom, which feeds the gun behind me here, the 5-inch gun. The next thing we're going to show you is a 20 millimeter. The ship has 8 guns like this. There's 4 in the port and 4 on the starboard side. This has a gun round. It holds 60 in this round clip. It feeds down here and feeds into this ammo bag. This gun has a range of 3 miles. This right here beside me is a spare barrel. When the barrels got so hot, they would unclip this here and they could switch the barrel out and they would put it back in the holder. These here are lightweight ammo reflecting shields right here. This is a 20, and like I said, we have 8 of these on the ship. The last gun we're going to be showing you is a 50 caliber machine gun. This gun would be used for anything approaching the vessel within 3 miles would be fired upon, or aircraft. It would be fired upon this gun. There are 2 guns like this located on the ship, and they're both on the signal bridge. This will be the end of our gun tour. Thank you very much. And here are one of 4 lifeboats that are located on the SS Victory Lane. They have a capacity of carry 40 men. These are motorized. They are lowered up and down by the trip on an electronic cable system. Now we're facing the stern of the ship, and we get a shot of two cargo holes behind us. We're 2 of 5 on the ship. This ship had a crew that unloaded this ship manually, and the booms that you see going out on both sides are cargo nets. So it's unloaded by cargo nets and manual labor. The approximate time for unloading a full loaded ship was about 1 week. Not only was this ship used for unloading cargo, but in the evacuation of Busan of the 7,000 refugees, the cargo holds were used for housing many of the civilians that were evacuated.
I'm going to tell you a little bit about the signal bridge on the SS Lane Victory. This that I'm pointing at is commonly known as the flag bag in the Navy. That's the term they use. Even though it's made out of metal, it's called the flag bag. And every ship has one, some have several. The Lane Victory only required to have one. And in order to restore the ship like it was in World War II, we had to have a flag bag here and have our signalmen on deck. The signalmen actually, this was their domain during World War II. The Merchant Marine signalmen that they had aboard ship did not send or receive any messages. The Navy strictly wanted the Navy trained signalmen to send and receive messages. And it happened in many cases where the officer then, once the message was hoisted, he would come over to the signalman and say, take that signal down and hoist this one up. So you had to do that very fast, within minutes, not 20 minutes or a half hour. It had to be done right away. And the signals would go up, they'd come down, they'd go up and come down, and it was very fast. So that's what happened, and this was the domain of the signalman, and we restored it now exactly the way it was in World War II. We're down in the wheelhouse. This is where all the driving takes place. The ship cannot move unless the proper officials are in here and navigating and doing the steering. When you're aboard ship, whether it's a United States Navy or Merchant Marine or any boat, small boat, yachts, and what have you, you have to speak a different language. And you have to know the terms that apply aboard ship. It's not the same as being in a building in civilian life. For instance, where I'm standing is not a floor, it's a deck. Alongside here, this enclosure, those are not walls that I'm pointing to. They're all bulkheads. Those round things you see there, where you can look out, that's not a window. They're called portholes. And all ships, no matter what size, and all boats have that same thing, and bulkheads, decks. And this here is not a ceiling that I'm pointing to. In the Navy and on any vessel, it's known as the overhead. So now we got that all straight, and we can all speak the same language. This instrument here is known as the engine order telegraph. The mate will usually move this handle when he wants to change speed, whether it's slow, half speed, full ahead, stop, stand by, and this telegraphs the message down into the engine room. There's another instrument exactly like this. An engineer down there, when he sees that movement, he knows what to do and how to control the speed that the mate is requesting. So that's how the speed is controlled. This is the binnacle. This contains a compass, and the helmsman, who stands over here behind this wheel, he looks through this window here, and he steers by the compass the course that the mate or the officer of the deck, if it was a Navy ship, tells them to steer. If it's 090, he steers 090. And he usually tells the officer that he's steering 090. And if there's any change of course, the mate or the officer of the deck will tell the helmsman to steer another course, and the helmsman will change course. And sometimes the ships, many times they zigzagged during wartime. They would be on one particular course, and 3 minutes later, they would change course to another course. And then 3 minutes later, go back to the other course that they were on to start with. And that's the way it went. I personally was on a ship that zigzagged all the way from Panama Canal to Sydney, Australia. And we zigzagged all by ourselves, no escorts, no planes or anybody else. We just, but traveling like that, you travel a longer distance when you zigzag. This chair here is the captain's chair. The captain usually comes up in the wheelhouse when the pilot's on board. And the pilots usually take the ships out of the harbor, and they also bring the ships into the harbor. So the captain's always around at both those times. And once the ship gets underway and it's on a definite course and the captain is satisfied, he usually leaves the wheelhouse and he goes down in the stateroom. He says to the officer of the deck, if you need me, I'm in my stateroom. Carry on. And that's what usually happens. But nobody sits in the captain's chair. Just the captain. And behind the wheelhouse, we're in the chart room. They're both adjacent to each other. Now this is where the navigation work is done. The captain comes in here and plots the charts, or the mates, or in the Navy, it would be the deck officers. They do all the navigating on ships. And they have, all ships have every map that every chart rather that you need to navigate. And they have drawers like here that are full of charts. And I say charts. In Navy terminology, you would never say map. That's a civilian term, like a road map. And it's charts in the military, the merchant marine. They're all referred to as charts. And to assist the navigator in navigating, he has what they call a parallel rule. They lay it down on the chart, and it assists the navigator in plotting the course. And he has other instruments. He has triangles like this that he uses, and so forth. There's another parallel rule. It's a little longer than the other one because you might want to use it for longer distance. There's also, on every ship, a log similar to this, where the navigator or the officer of the deck, who's standing watch for about 4 hours at a time, he enters in that log anything that's of important, or sometimes things that are not quite as important, but he will make an entry as to what happened during the 4 hours he's standing the watch. And then that log, he writes it out in freehand, and then later that log is turned over to the yeoman on the ship. A yeoman on the ship is one who works a typewriter, and they will type it all up so it's nice and neat and so forth. But every ship, whether it's merchant marine, United States Navy, or boats, yachts have logs. Here we are, folks, back again, and now we're aboard the LST 812. The LST stands for Landing Ship Tanks. It's an amphibious craft, and it's 330 feet long, and we're at Saipan in the Pacific. February 19th, 1945, we were going to be involved in the invasion of Iwo Jima. It was an island closer to Saipan, and we had to sail about 700 miles north of where we are here in Saipan and travel in a convoy to get there. So we had to start out several days ahead of time and arrive at the island at 9 o'clock in the morning on D-Day for the invasion. We had 453 4th Division Marines on board. These Marines had all their gear with them, and they also were in about 4 other invasions prior to this one, Iwo Jima, that was coming up in the next few days. We arrived on time in convoy to off the shore of Iwo Jima at 9 o'clock in the morning. And we had instructions to beach at Iwo Jima at, I believe it was called Baker Beach. The beach wasn't very long. I would say it might have been a quarter of a mile long, and it was the only beach on the island. It was the only place that we could land. The rest of the island was all rock and ledge. So when the invasion took place, it didn't take long for the beach to get overcrowded. And there was a problem with the soil. Instead of it being normal beach sand that is very fine like grains of sugar, this beach, the soil was like sawdust, so to speak. And when you stepped on it, you would be in up to your ankles. And if you put a vehicle on it, it started to bog down. And before you know it, all the vehicles that they offloaded from the LSTs were bogged down, and it was blocking traffic for other ships to come along and unload their vehicles. Plus the fact, with these vehicles like that, there was no place for the Marines to hide in case they were under fire. And as they were offloading their trucks and equipment, they weren't under fire by the Japanese. However, the Japanese waited until the beach was overloaded and bogged down, and they could hardly move, and they had no protection. They opened up from both ends of the island. They had their guns hidden in caves, and they opened up on the beach. And there was an awful lot of casualties. And in the meantime, after we unloaded the LST 812, we backed off the beach and were told to go anchor out and wait for further orders. This was on the third day of the invasion. So we were out there waiting for further orders. In the meantime, prior to that, we got information was passed to us that the Marines that we offloaded that first day, there was 50% of them were casualties. We don't know the extent of the casualties, whether it was just wounds or deaths or what, but it was a bad event. And what they had to do was go from the beach up to a plateau, and that was level, and that ground was firm, but they couldn't get up there. And they were supposed to turn right when they hit the island. That is the Marine Division, 4th Marine Division. Their job was to turn right and do and head for the other end of the island. But they were slowed down in every which way, and the island was full of caves. And they had multiple caves going in every direction. There were 20,000 Japanese holed up on Iwo Jima. And on D-Day, when the Marines landed for the invasion, they didn't see one Japanese on the surface. So how can you fight a war when you don't even see the enemy? And the island was made of sulfur rock. Sulfur is fairly soft, and for them to dig those tunnels wasn't as difficult as if they were trying to dig tunnels through granite. And they dug those tunnels, not all of them just prior to the invasion. They dug those tunnels during the Depression days, in the 30s. They even had a huge space down there that they used for the hospital. And they had lighting in there and everything. But it turned out they lost, and out of the 20,000 Japanese that were originally on the island, I think maybe 200 survived. And it was a tough fight. We thought originally that it would only take a couple of weeks to win the battle. It took about 3 months because of them hiding in these caves and so forth. And then there was Mount Suribachi, which was a mountain that was 550 feet tall. That was also full of caves. And I personally talked to the men that made the assault on Mount Suribachi and went to the top and hoisted the flag, because I met them at a reunion, not once, a couple of times. So I got a lot of information firsthand from them. My ship left Iwo Jima on the third day. We went back to Saipan. On the fourth day, the flag was raised on Mount Suribachi. And the Marines were very happy to see that flag up there, but the war wasn't over. It was continued on for 3 more months. And there were 2 flags raised, actually. The first flag was a small flag. It was measured about 3 feet by 5 feet, type of flag that you would have out in front of your house. The colonel, the leader of the squad, didn't particularly like that small flag. So he told one of the Marines that assaulted, got up to the top, to go down to the beach and inquire of those LSTs if they have a flag, a good-sized flag, bigger than that 3 by 5. So this sergeant went down there, and he came back, and a couple hours later with a flag. He got a flag off of one of the LSTs. So that was hoisted up, and the other flag was taken down. But what happened is, there was a photographer there from Associated Press. His name was Joe Rosenfeld. And he was walking around in those days with the old-fashioned bellow-type cameras, you know, that they have. He had it under his arm or whatever, and he was making his way up to the top of Mount Suribachi. On his way up, somebody said to him, "Hey, Joe, they're taking a picture. They're raising a flag." Well, they had already taken the first flag down. They were putting the second flag up. And he turned to that fellow and he says, where? He says, well, over there, on top of the hill, top of the mountain here. Okay. So the photographer, Joe Rosenfeld, was about halfway up Mount Suribachi, and he just took the picture. That was it. And then he went on with his business and finally made his way up there. In those days, it took a long time to get a picture back to the United States. It's not like today, turn on your computer and your printer and you send it, and it's bingo, it's there. No, it took several months to get mail back to the United States. And eventually, Joe Rosenfeld went back to Guam, island of Guam. That's where he started out. And somebody said to him, "Hey, Joe," this was a couple months later. "Hey, Joe," he says, "boy, that was a fabulous picture you took." Joe says, "Picture? What picture?" He took so many pictures, you know, during the war, he didn't know what picture he's talking about. He says, "That picture you took in Mount Suribachi." "Oh," he says, "that picture?" "Oh, yeah," he said, they got it back in the States, and it's they're using it for a fund drive and this and that. It was the most fabulous picture ever taken in World War II. Well, he couldn't believe it, you know. He felt that he did anything exceptional. Just snapped the camera. And there was nobody posing. He didn't have anybody posing for the picture. But it turned out that that photograph was the most publicized photograph of World War II. But 6 weeks later, after we formed up there at Saipan, which was our staging area, we were getting ready for the invasion of Kyushu, Japan. And we knew from experience that there was going to be many ships in this invasion and many troops in this invasion. And we knew that the Japanese were suicidal people. They weren't going to give up one fistful of dirt of their property. And so then that's when the atomic bombs came into the picture. Harry Truman had the stuff in him to say, okay, drop the bombs. So they dropped one bomb on Hiroshima, which was on August the 6th, 1945. With that, the Japanese didn't say anything. They didn't say, well, hey, we give up. So they decided, well, let's drop another bomb. We only had 2 bombs at that time, but the Japanese didn't know we only had 2 bombs. So they decided to drop the second bomb on the city of Nagasaki. And that did small, terrible damage and destruction. So with that, then the Japanese says, okay, we've had it, that's enough. They thought, well, you know, if we had more bombs, we're going to drop them somewhere else. But that didn't happen, and the war was over. So then the ship Missouri was out there in the vicinity, and they sent it over to Tokyo Bay with the dignitaries and so forth, and all the admirals and the generals from the United States on board the ship. And then they signed the surrender document aboard the Missouri. See, and there's a plaque on the Missouri today. The Missouri is in Hawaii, and it's there. I guess they're going to keep it there forever, and it's out there not too far from the Arizona, and it's on display for tourists. And when you go on board, you can see this plaque out on the main deck toward the bow on the starboard side of the ship. It's a beautiful plaque, and it tells all about it. After the war was over, about 30 years later, one of my shipmates who was doing research, trying to locate the sailors that sailed with us and so forth, happened to locate Captain Frank Eddy here in California in Dana Point. I live here in California in Huntington Beach, 25 miles north of Dana Point. I know the town very well. And I also had his phone number, so I called him up. And we made arrangements to get together about a week later. We renewed our old friendship, and we talked about World War II, and he told me that his claim to fame when he was out there was offloading the 2 crates off of the cruiser Indianapolis. He said when they ordered him to go over there alongside of the cruiser to pick them up, he wasn't told what was in the crates. He didn't know what was in the crates until they were dropped on Japan. That's when he found out. That's what was in the crates that he picked up off of the Indianapolis. He said feels that was his claim to fame, that he did that. So with that, I said to him, I said, well, you rode piggyback on my LST all the way from New Orleans to Saipan. And I says, you might say, put you in harm's way, so to speak. And you and your crew. And he says, yeah, that's right. So we went to many reunions. After that, we'd get together. They'd have Navy reunions all around the country. And we would attend those and look forward to the next reunion. And we made many trips. We went to many naval stations, Navy bases, because as a retiree, I'm allowed to go to any base I want to, anywhere around the country. And I would take him along with me. And we would fly around the country and, you know, take a plane, go here, go there. And we just had a good time. He was a fine gentleman. And to this day, I kind of miss him because we did have a lot of good times together. And he passed away, sorry to say, about, I think it was about 5 years ago. He was close to 95 years old.
We're here on the Lane Victory in cargo hold number 2, where we have a museum. And behind me is some memorabilia of World War II about the Pearl Harbor. I'm here to give tribute to Warren Allen Jones, my mom's first husband, who went down on the Arizona as a radio operator December 7th, 1941. My mom was married to Warren Allen Jones. Her name was Helen Josephine Grimes in Kearney, Nebraska, November 1938. They made their home in Long Beach, California. Warren Allen Jones was deployed to the Hawaiian Islands in 1938. The story goes from my mom that he had a premonition. He told his best friend Lukey, who was his classmate and also from Kearney, Nebraska, if anything should happen to me, make sure my wife and my son Bobby Jones gets back to California, which he did. Warren's premonition was right. On that day, he lost his life on the Arizona. They believe, being a radio operator, he was in the bridge. He also went down with over 1,000+ men that gave them lives so valiantly that day. A big price to pay for freedom. This day will always live in my heart, and I'm sure the hearts of many, many American people.